Stoops. And by now, I think most people have probably seen the quotes, seen the headlines. You know a little bit of the backstory. This has been in the news cycle for about 24 hours by the time I'm talking about this, maybe even longer by the time you're listening. But at the same time, it was such a juicy quote. It was so fascinating. And I think, frankly, that Mark Stoops looks so bad that I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this a little bit. And so by now, again, I think everybody kind of knows the backstory, but it centers on Saturday night in Athens, Georgia. Kentucky is in the midst of another really good season, came into Saturday 5-0, traveled to face the Georgia Bulldogs, the number one team in the country. Georgia's operating at a really high level, but I think even Georgia fans would admit they haven't been perfect. They need to work on some stuff, whatever. Kentucky comes in the game as a 14.5-point underdog. You think, okay, Kentucky could probably keep it close. Yeah, no. Final score, Georgia 51, Kentucky 13. And it wasn't just that Kentucky lost the game. It was the manner in which it happened. It wasn't just that Georgia had better players. It was that Kentucky came in looking unprepared. There were penalties. There were turnovers. And oh, by the way, let's be honest. Mark Stoops didn't have his best moment late in the half with some play calling, with some clock management stuff. It gave Georgia extra points and extra momentum going into halftime, and the game was essentially over. Anyway, coming out of the game, Kentucky fans were a little bit frustrated. By the way, I think rightly so. I myself am a fan. I understand what it's like coming off of a loss where you thought you had a chance against a good team and you get destroyed. And so Mark Stoops was asked about it after the game. And he was asked about it more specifically on his Monday call-in radio show. And so Mark Stoops was kind of asked about the fan reaction and what do you make of it and all that good stuff. And here is what Mark Stoops had to say. He said, quote, "Fans have the right to complain. I give it to them. I just encourage them to donate more because that's what those dudes are doing. I can promise you, Georgia, they bought some pretty good players. You're allowed to do that these days. We could use some help." Let me say this. I don't know where those quotes from Mark Stoops came from. I don't know whether he truly believes he's at an NIL disadvantage, if he was trying to rally the troops, if he's frustrated with the fans' reaction to the game. I don't know exactly why he said what he said. But at the same time, I think it was a really bad look. I think it made him look bad. I think it made his program look bad. And I just think if he could, I just think it was a really bad look all around for Mark Stoops. And I don't think there's any defending it. First of all, let's just think about it at the most basic level, okay? Mark Stoops going on his radio show, being asked about losing to Georgia and fans' reaction. And he says, the first thing that comes to his mind, it says, well, you all have to pony up to get some better players. Well, you know who that makes look bad? You know who looks bad in that situation? Pretty much everybody. First off, the $8 million a year head coach probably needs to be a little bit better. I'm sorry. You get paid a lot of money. You need to put better effort. But at the same time, it looks especially bad because you're paid $8 million and you are trying to place blame everywhere other than on your own shoulders, okay? It'd be one thing if Mark Stoops, and maybe he said this after the game on Saturday, where it's one thing if you say, we weren't good enough at all. We weren't good enough I wasn't good enough as a head coach. The assistants weren't good enough. The players weren't good enough. This was a total team effort, but it falls on my shoulders. That's the right way. That's how I would want my coach to handle it. But what Mark Stoops basically said was this: don't blame me. There was nothing I could do. Those 85 guys in that locker room aren't good enough. And I know he probably didn't mean it like that. And I'm sure there aren't a line of guys, ready to hand in their jerseys because they don't want to play for him because they got thrown under the bus. But that was basically what he just said. Those 85 dudes in my locker room aren't good enough. And it's like, probably not the best message to send to your team. And I also don't think it's the best message to send to your fans. Again, it looks like you're trying to say, sorry, guys and girls, it's all your fault. Donate more money or we're never going to win. That's not what I want to hear as a fan coming out of that game. And I'll be blunt. That's especially not what I want to hear from my $8 million a year head coach. Listen, I can't speak to everyone's financial situation, but most people who give to these collectives aren't giving $100,000, $500,000, $1 million donations. They're giving what they can because they love their football teams. Now, are there million donations, $5 million donations, $2 million donations. Of course they are. But there's also $100 donations, $500 donations, $250 donations by people that just want to see their team succeed. So when I'm given $200 of my discretionary income that I really don't have because I want my football team to be good, I'm sorry, it does not look good from my $8 million a year head coach to say, well, you got to give more. And oh, by the way, Mark Stoops ain't giving back a penny of his money. And I know what everybody would say. Well, the coaches can't pay players. The coaches can't give money to collectives. I get that. I also think that if Mark Stoops quietly went to his AD, Mitch Barnhart, and said, give me $6 million a year instead of 8 and put everything else in. There are ways that it could be arranged, but nobody wants to hear that from their $8 million a year head football coach. And again, Mark Stoops is asking other people to give money. He ain't offering to give any back himself. And again, I understand it's against the rules. I understand he can't give to a collective, but I just think it looks incredibly bad from an $8 million a year head coach. I also think it looks bad to call out Georgia specifically in that manner, okay? Because at the end of the day, Georgia has the best team in college football, not because of NIL, but because of a number of different factors, and maybe NIL is one of them. Georgia does everything at an elite level. They recruit well. They develop well. They're putting guys in the NFL. Their NFL guys are playing well. They practice well. They go on and on down the list, okay? I bring it up because this is not solely about NIL. If Washington State or Purdue or Boston College had the number one team in the country with this roster, we could ask questions. I don't think Georgia having this kind of roster is all that confusing. They have this roster because they win at a high level. They put dudes in the NFL. And yes, NIL is part of the puzzle, but Mark Stoops is acting like it's the only reason, and we all know that it's not. By the way, Georgia was recruiting at an elite level long before NIL. Just to make sure, I looked it up. NIL came into place in 2021, the summer of 2021. Well, guess what? In the previous 3 recruiting cycles, many of those players still on the team. 2019, Georgia, the number 2 recruiting class in the country. 2020, Georgia, the number 1 recruiting class in the country. 2021, which was a smaller class, was only ranked number 4 in the country. So they've always recruited well. It's not about NIL. They're not getting all these guys solely because they're paying them more than anybody else. And again, it just makes you look bad. Finally, let me say a quick message to not only Mark Stoops, but any coach in college sports that is going to complain publicly or privately about NIL. I get that it's a new era. I get that your fans need to donate money for you to have success at the highest level. But what I can also tell you, I've worked in college sports for a long time. I have pretty good sources, pretty good contacts. And I have talked to 2 different donors at 2 different big-time SEC schools, neither of them Kentucky, so just let the record show, that are kind of burned out by getting hit up by everybody for money. And what I have noticed in college sports right now at this second, boosters, they're burned out because they've been asked for years, help pay this coach's salary, pay for your tickets, pay your donations, help with the buyouts, help with the assistant pools, help with these facilities. And I get there's money that comes from other places, but boosters and donors are expected to foot a lot of the bill. Now they are being asked to pay for the players on top of the coaches, the assistants, the salary pools, the facilities, the whatever. And they're getting kind of burned out. But at the same time, as long as you win, it's fine. And so that's my message to Mark Stoops. Be careful about being too public about asking for money, because it all goes well as long as you're winning. But the second that you stop winning, a lot of those fans are going to sit there and say, now, wait a second. I listened to that radio show. You told me you needed more money. Well, I donated this. Well, I donated that. And we still aren't very good. And so what's your excuse, Coach Stoops? And I think that is going to be something to monitor in these college football coaching carousels and back at whatever going forward. I believe that fans are going to increasingly become less patient with their coaches as time goes on, if that's even possible, because fans aren't patient at all. And that doesn't mean that Mark Stoops is on the hot seat or anything, but what it means is fans are giving more. They are being asked more of, to donate to this, donate to that, give to this, give to that, help us pay NIL. And they want to see results. And so Mark Stoops, my advice is this: if this is your messaging, One, I don't love it because I think you kind of threw your own players under the bus. But two, you better win, because if people are giving, and they're seeing results like they saw on Saturday, they're not going to keep giving for very much longer.